Here's the problem. If we look at this and all we see is that Paul is saying you tip the scales with your own personal experience, then our job becomes this. I have to have a compelling enough story to tip the scales so that men will be saved. Now, it's not the gospel that's the power of God unto salvation. It's my story. That's why people start lying. Amen. If you can't say amen, you ought to say ouch. You ought to hear some testimonies and how they develop over time. Person gets in one fight in the 3rd grade. 20 years after being saved, I fought every day. Person took a sip of whiskey when they were a teenager. All of a sudden, after 20 years of telling their testimony, I used to get drunk almost every day after school. Father looked at them disapprovingly one day. 20 years later in their testimony, Daddy abandoned me. I had no... But here's what's worse. You have Christians in church who listen to these inflated testimonies, who will say this phrase, and I don't know whether to hug them or hit them. I don't have a testimony. In other words, there are these powerful stories, these captivating stories. And what we're all about is these powerful, captivating stories. That's a testimony because it tips the scales. It gets people to respond. It makes people stand up and take notice of God and what he has done. All I have is God wrapped himself in flesh, died on a cross, nailed my sin thereto, was placed in the grave, rose again on the 3rd day, ascended to the right hand of the Father, and is there making intercession for me until such time as my salvation is completed and he takes me home. That's all I got. Don't you ever fall into that trap. Paul is not making much of his own personal story here. Paul is making much of the fact that God has gone out of his way to present this gospel in an historic context that is verifiable and falsifiable. In other words, it could have been proven false, but it wasn't. That's the point. That's the argument from authority says to those who claim to be Christian. You say you follow Christ, you say you believe the gospel, but what you're preaching is not the gospel. Something here doesn't add up. The authority from evidence says this: God went public with the gospel, and it's verified. It's real. As John says in 1 John 1, what we have seen, what our hands have handled. I love that phrase. That's his argument. Then he makes the 3rd argument, the argument from logic. Here's where he gets right into the face of his opposition. Now, if Christ is proclaimed as raised from the dead, how can some of you say there is no resurrection of the dead? There's the question. If Christ is proclaimed as being raised from the dead, how can some of you say there's no resurrection of the dead? He didn't say, how can some of you say that Christ wasn't resurrected? Here's the problem. There are people who evidently are hanging on around the Corinthian church and like some aspect of what they're experiencing. But they don't like this one aspect where the gospel that is being preached rubs up against their personal philosophy that doesn't allow for the concept of resurrection. So what they want is a resurrectionless Christianity. They want a Christianity that will fit within the context and confines of their presuppositions. So Paul says, argument from authority. Here's what I have preached to you as an apostle. Argument from evidence. Here's what God has verified and validated historically in the open. Now he gets to the argument from logic, and he says, there are some of you who on the one hand want to say that you are attached, but on the other hand want to say that your personal philosophy doesn't allow for the concept of resurrection. We look at this and all we see is that Paul is saying, you tip the scales with your own personal experience, then our job becomes this. I have to have a compelling enough story